Hello and welcome to the TID Water and Power Podcast. I'm your host, Constance Anderson, and on this month's episode, we're discussing climate change and the impacts to the Tuolumne River Watershed hydrology. TID is an industry leader in water operations thanks to investments in forecasting and modeling, as well as the talented team behind the efforts. But to maintain those operations and ensure safe and reliable water supply for our customers, the district is assessing the ever-changing hydrology and climate. On this episode, I'm joined by TID Water and Power Resources Planning Department Manager, Olivia Cramer, to discuss the water year outlook and how we are assessing and mitigating climate change in our watershed. Olivia, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me again.
All right, so you are no stranger to the TID Water and Power Podcast, having most recently joined us in February of 2025. In fact, you are our most frequent flyer.
Yeah, it is a little bit like deja vu when I come into this recording room.
And we love that you keep coming back to us because I think it makes sense that we've had you on so many times because the area in which you work and the topic in which you're typically sharing with us is probably one of the most volatile that TID has to consider in its year-to-year, day-to-day operations. And so we're excited to have you back again to talk a little bit more about the water year outlook this year and then how what we're doing with that information and moving forward. So let's get started. For those of our listeners who haven't heard one of your previous podcasts, can you give us a little bit about your background and your career path at the district?
Sure. So it's kind of crazy to think that it started almost 10 years ago.
Wow.
Where summer of 2016 started my first internship. I was getting my bachelor's degree down at UC Santa Barbara in hydrology. And I was looking for a position where I could start to kind of learn the real world skills of it. And I'm from Turlock originally, so it happened that TID was looking for someone. And so started in 2016, decided it was so exciting. I came back in 2017 as an intern. And then finally in 2018, I was actually hired on full time as a hydrologist for the district. And then from there, built up my skills as that analyst hydrologist, and then finally in January of 2025 was promoted to chief hydrologist for the district when our previous chief hydrologist, Wes Monnier, who had been with the district for almost 36 years,
right,
decided to retire and was let me take over the reins, essentially. So definitely big shoes to fill, but it was very exciting.
Excellent.
To go into that role.
Very good. And now you hold a different role.
Yes. So, before I could even hit my 1-year anniversary as chief hydrologist, decided to switch it up a little bit. And so now I am the Water and Power Resource Planning Department Manager. Still getting used to the wordful of all of that. So that was as of December of 2025, I transitioned into that position.
That's awesome. Well, congratulations on that. I understand that the position you hold now and that whole area is kind of a new organizational structure for TID. How was it determined that resource planning for both water and power, which are kind of typically two sides of the house, should be combined under one area?
Yes. So as you mentioned, I think most of the time people think water and power should not mix. And that is very true in the real world.
Very true.
In the case of TID, we are TID Water and Power. And so the fact that I think those two sides of the house often kind of worked separately from each other, both trying to plan for the reliability of the district in their respective areas. Mm-hmm. But as we move forward, it was looking at, we should start to look at our planning from a more holistic perspective as a district. And could there be potentially solutions on both sides of the house that could help the other one? Mm-hmm. And, really looking at those areas, we deal with a lot of the same things, maybe in a different, it's different units. One's megawatts and one's acre feet. But they both involve a lot of volatility, both from a regulatory perspective, as well as from just natural phenomenon, including climate changes being one of those. So both areas are about how do we manage our risks today and moving forward.
Very cool. That makes a lot of sense. So a year ago, when you were last on the podcast, we were sitting well below average for the 2024-2025 water year. And while we did see some improvement, ultimately that water year did end below average. This year, however, things are looking a little bit different. How is the 2025-2026 water year shaking out?
Yes, so as of now, the water year started October 1. So water years go from October 1st to September 30th. So it doesn't follow a typical calendar year. And so far, we've actually had normal precipitation. And as always in California water, we have these big bouts of, extreme weather followed by long bouts of dry weather. So that's what we kind of have seen this year, where we had some initial storms coming in the fall and in December, followed by a pretty dry end of January going into February period. But that mixture has still led us to being pretty close to average when it comes to precipitation.
And as of March 1st, then, how does the Tuolumne River Watershed measure up to those averages?
So as of March 1st, we are at 24.19 inches. And that's compared to a historic, when we're thinking of a September through March, you typically see about 30.59 inches. So as I mentioned, we're sitting at average for the date. When we do the comparisons, we are looking to the end of March. So we have some opportunities that we're looking for ideally another 6 inches to occur within the month of March in order for us to kind of keep maintaining that average level of precipitation.
Our precipitation numbers are near normal, but that's really only one side of the coin. What do our snowpack numbers look like right now?
Yes. So normally what we would have seen historically, you like to see storms coming in with freezing levels of 3,000 feet or less, something like what we saw in 2023 where we had snowfall at Don Pedro.
Crazy.
So that's the ideal scenario for us. But these storms that we've had, the initial ones were sitting around 6,000 feet. And then because we had drier, warmer conditions previously, you start to lose some of that lower elevation snow. And then the most recent storm actually had freezing levels up to 11,000 feet. And so in those storms, you see a lot of losses in those lower elevations. And so with all of that, even though we're at almost 100% of normal precipitation, our snowpack is sitting at about 63% of normal for the date, and we're about 56% of the April 1 average. The importance of April 1 is that's usually the marker between when you transition from snow accumulation to snowmelt runoff. And so that's our main factor of when we're thinking about long-term planning. We want to get close to that April 1 number. Yes, it's always good to see when you're in January and you're saying, oh, we're at 100% of normal snowpack for the date, but you could still have a long ways to go in order to get you to a normal snowpack for the long-term planning.
Right, absolutely. Okay. So despite the dry year we had last year, and I'm putting dry in air quotes because we were still able to offer growers a full allotment of water, and it may not have come across as a dry year, but we'll get to that in a minute. We came into this water year with Don Pedro in a relatively good place. And I'm sure that outlook has probably improved with the wet winter that we've had, but can you tell us a little bit about how the reservoir is standing right now?
Yes. So last year we experienced about a 70% of normal water year. And with that, that's where the benefit of having a large storage reservoir comes in, is that you can have a below average water year, but operationally, you're able to still provide full available water to farmers, and you can still go into the next year with a good amount of water to carry over for future seasons. And so that's a benefit of having that kind of reservoir rather than being beholden to year-to-year volatility. And had we not had Don Pedro, then we would have had below average available water to our farmers with a 70% water year.
Right.
But going into this year, after the irrigation season of last year, the reservoir was sitting at 786 feet. For reference, normally by the end of irrigation season, the maximum we can have our reservoir at is 801.9 feet.
Okay.
So we were below the normal maximum, But as far as, how much space to get us back up to normal levels, it didn't take too much of a storm in order to push us into flood control operations. So right now we are sitting at 805 feet within the reservoir. So we're actually considered, the term is called encroached. So we're encroached into our flood control space. Now that might sound scary of being in a flood control space, but really that's the purpose of that, is that when you do have potentially warmer storms that run off a little bit faster than, snow melt, which is done in months of runoff.
Sure.
These rainfall events, you need to have space to be able to absorb them quickly without having to make huge changes to your river operations or to just strictly follow your inflows. Because sometimes with these storms, you can see inflows getting to 20, 30 plus thousand CFS coming into your system. And when you're looking downstream of a channel capacity of only 11,000 CFS, that's where you want that storage space to be able to absorb those peaks and be able to keep things level within the system.
Makes sense. Okay. So as I mentioned, I kind of want to double back to look at the last few years, because I as you mentioned, we were at 70% last year, but we're still in an okay spot for this year. So can you kind of give us maybe a historical perspective on the last few years and kind of how those have built upon each other?
Yes, so it has been a little bit of although the last couple of years we've been able to provide 48 inches, each of those years have had a different kind of operation when it comes to the hydrology itself. So starting off 2023, that was the first year that we went back after the 3-year drought of 2020 to 2022, where we were making reductions in our available water, going back to a full 48 inches. Now, 2023 was one of the largest snowpack years on record. So we were actually getting those cold storms. So as I mentioned earlier about that storm we saw back in 2023 where it was snowing at Don Pedro and you see this really low elevations, that was that year. And so with that one, we had to do a lot of what we call pre-flood control planning. So although during that winter we didn't actually enter into the flood control space, we knew that there was such a large snowpack up there that the reservoir was not large enough in order to absorb all of that. Mm-hmm. And so we had to almost dig a hole in order to create that space within the reservoir. So that was the operations that we had to do in 2023. And in 2023, we kept the river at channel capacity for almost 73 days straight in order to keep that amount of space, because we were looking at almost 2 million acre feet of snowpack sitting up there. You think about the full size of Don Pedro is 2.03 million acre feet. So you have almost a whole Don Pedro sitting up there. You have to create the space for it.
You have to create the space. Yeah, absolutely.
And then kind of a different water year as we transitioned out of 2023. We exited 2023 with a very full reservoir and definitely a lot of stress after that year. Going into 2024, what every reservoir operator hopes for is you want that Goldilocks year where it's not too wet and not too dry. And it happened that's kind of what we got out of 2024. It was slightly below average when we went into the year. But overall, we were able to manage the reservoir. We didn't have any kind of pre-flood control operations in that year. The one thing that happened is that we saw earlier runoff from the system. So normally in an average snowpack year, you'll see runoff kind of ending around middle of July. And that's usually the time that we'll see Don Pedro elevation peak, is around the peak of when that snowpack runs off. And then at that point, our demands start to exceed our inflows. Now in 2024, what we saw was almost a month shift in that timing. So our runoff ended around June 7th is when we saw all that snowpack ran off. And the importance of that is trying to time when is your big surge in demand and when do you have that runoff helping to serve your demand. If you no longer have that runoff, all your demand is served by storage versus normally where you have both storage and inflows to help serve that demand.
Sure. It's kind of like almost knowing when your paychecks are coming versus when you have to live off your savings.
Exactly. That's a good example of that. And then going from 24, so we had the reservoir. It wasn't completely depleted, but we were going into 2024. We had a very dry fall period in 2024. And so at that point, we were looking at, okay, we might be entering a year where we need to potentially make reductions to our available water. And we were going into where we didn't have a ton of snowpack either as we were going into the available water decision. And so as we went to the board, we actually was the first time in my career where we brought two options to the board, one in which we provided a suggestion of 44 inches to the farmer and another one with the 48 inches to give them the flexibility to decide. We were seeing forecasts coming in, rainfall forecasts that were pretty big, and that would help improve things, and allowing them to decide, do we want to bank on those forecasts and go ahead and use storage a little bit more aggressively within Don Pedro, or do we want to be more conservative and, have that expectation of these forecasts don't always come to fruition.
Right.
And we need to be planning for that next year as well. And so it ended up, those storms did come in, and the board did choose to go with a 48-inch available water. And, we also in that year saw a similar thing to 2024 of early runoff. But in 2025, we were able to work with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So just to kind of give a little bit of background of who the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and what their purpose is with the reservoir. As I mentioned earlier, we have flood control space within Don Pedro. So we hold about 340,000 acre feet of flood control space. Purpose of that is for any of these rain flood events, any of these events that come in and you only have hours or days and you don't have a lot of channel capacity to be able to absorb. And so with that, we hold that from October 7th until April 27th. And so during that period of time, we need to maintain about that 340,000 acre feet of space. But what we were noticing as we were going into April is we don't have a lot of snowpack and we're not seeing any storms coming in. Is there a potential that rather than bypassing this inflow that we're receiving, all of this snow melt that's happening now that won't be happening in that June, July period you normally expect, can we capture it?
Yeah.
Because we aren't seeing the flood control risk and the need to have that full 340,000 acre feet available. And so because of that operations and because of the coordination with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, we were able to actually save almost 100,000 acre feet by not bypassing those flows during that April period.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So ultimately, even with a 70% water year, that's why we went into this year with a reservoir that was higher than you would normally expect after that type of year.
Sure. Well, and I'd just like to point out, too, that you guys had that confidence that of when the snowpack was coming down. You had the confidence of the fact that there weren't additional storms coming in because of the forecasting and modeling that your team does on the regular basis. Whereas I feel like a decade ago, we wouldn't have been able to have that conversation with the Army Corps because we didn't have the confidence. We didn't have the data to back up that position. So I think that's a big change that's come about recently.
No, and that does highlight the importance of the types of investments that have been made by the district in bringing in these new tools and technologies. Because like you mentioned, in the past, we would have been looking at historical indexes, and historically, snowmelt runoff starts April 1st, and it's done in the middle of July.
Sure.
Well, what we're seeing is the world doesn't follow that pattern all the time, and that you can't always just use history, and that you should be looking at your current conditions instead. So let's go ahead and capture what those current conditions are through technologies that we've talked about in previous episodes, like the Airborne Snow Observatory, where we can accurately capture current snowpack measurements instead of only having a couple of small measurements throughout the watershed and making a large assumption of how much water is being held up there, knowing exactly every drop of water that's in your system and that is, ready to come down into your reservoir.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so getting back to this year, with the amount of precipitation that we've received this winter, we have had to make some pre-flood releases and kind of act on sort of a wet year operations plan. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. So going into this year, when you're sitting at 786 feet after irrigation, the amount of space that you have is about 150,000 acre feet before you hit that flood control curve.
Okay.
And a good kind of back of the envelope is whenever we see a storm of, an inch, can be about 50,000 acre feet of water input to the system.
Okay.
Now, that doesn't mean automatically 50,000 acre feet is running off. It's that, that 50,000 acre feet is being inputted. 20,000 could go to runoff, 10,000 can go to snowpack, and the rest of it go to soil moisture. So that's where the importance of the modeling comes in, is that back of the envelope is good for just getting overall volumes, but you do need those models to then distribute where those volumes go.
Sure.
But because of the fact that we were seeing a little bit warmer of a storm, we knew that a good portion of that was going to come in as runoff. So you can fill that system with just a fairly small storm when you only have 150,000 acre feet. And so that's where, as we were going into December, we had already had a pretty good fall. So we had very normal or above average rainfall for September, October, and November. Mm-hmm. Really what those do is they didn't build our snowpack. Those come in as a bit warmer of storms. It's during the fall period. But what they do is they help wet the system. So they help bring soil moisture values back up after all of that summer depletion. It's when the trees are really thirsty. They start sucking up a lot of that soil moisture. And so you do need to replenish it. And so what we knew is our watershed was primed. That's kind of the term we'll think of it as, is any storm that comes in now is going to be pretty efficient. You're not going to see a ton of losses to that soil moisture bucket.
Okay.
And as we went into December, at first it was fairly dry, the beginning part of December. And then going into mid-December, we started to see some activity within the forecasts. Initially, it was just within that 16-day period, and we were seeing a lot of disagreement between models. So we look at a lot of different weather forecast models coming from both the, United States has their own forecasts, Europe has their own forecasting, Canada has their own forecasting. So we were pulling in everyone's information and comparing it. And with that, we were seeing a big range of sometimes some of them were saying you're only going to see 2 inches in 16 days, and other ones going all the way up to 30 plus inches in that 16-day period.
For the same 16-day period, there was that much of a range?
Yes, for the same 16 days. And so that's where, as a hydrologist, it puts you on notice that there's potential for something big, but at that point, you don't make any operational changes, right? There's too much variation at that point to be making any huge changes. But as you go through time, you continue to track those. So as those events get closer and closer, ideally, you like to see the models start to get closer and closer as well,
come
like
together.
A little more agreement as you're getting closer in time. Now, unfortunately, as it got closer, we started getting to day 10, 9, 8. We were still seeing big gaps between the models. Now, it did improve where it was from 8 inches to 25 inches, but that still is a huge range in what you need to respond to.
Yeah.
And when you have an 8-day forecast coming from a agency of the United States government telling you you're going to see 25 inches coming into your watershed, and you're putting that through your modeling, and it's showing you're going to be opening your spillway in the next 7 days.
Wow.
That's where you start moving. And so at that point, that's when we were starting to increase river releases. And each day that forecast held on, we continued to up those releases. And our peak was at 7,500 CFS to the river. Once again, reference 11,000 CFS is our peak. So we still had some room within the system, but we wanted to be responsive to what we were seeing. Thankfully, we didn't have the 25-inch forecast come in. Overall, through that period, we ended up only actually seeing about 8 inches of rainfall. So with that, that's where people probably saw the river moved up and it quickly moved down. And that's part of the process of when you're dealing with volatile systems and you are trying to be as proactive as possible and you are making decisions on the information you have at that time.
Absolutely.
At that time, we had to measure our risks, and the risk of not doing anything was way higher than the risk of if we went ahead and moved our releases up and were a little bit more responsive to those forecast that we were seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. And now thinking about some of these storms that we've had recently, I feel like gone are the days where we would have like a gentle meandering sprinkle for, 4, 5, 7 days. And it seems like it's all coming at one time in what you guys refer to as an atmospheric river. Tell us about atmospheric rivers and kind of what impacts those have on our operations and our watershed.
Yes, so atmospheric rivers, in a way, it's kind of become the new trendy word. Anytime you turn on the news and there's going to be a big storm, they're saying, oh, it's an atmospheric river. And it's not that this is a new phenomena. This is a very common thing. So somehow the East Coast has hurricanes, the West Coast has atmospheric rivers. That is our extreme weather event driver.
Okay.
But also, although atmospheric rivers are often connected to these extreme wet events and floods, they also are the major driver of water supply within California. So they are an important component of California weather and of California water supply. So it's the reason why we've been making a lot of investments in the research and forecasting of these events in order to be able to capture how often are they coming in? What is the intensity of those storms? And starting to translate and communicate that to people so that way they have a better feel of what risks that they have, as well as understanding the benefits that can come from those types of events.
Right.
And just to kind of give a little idea of what an atmospheric river is, a lot of people's typical understanding of them is the Pineapple Express, which that is a form of atmospheric river. That's the warmer atmospheric rivers that come in that get a lot of influence from the Pacific. So it's a warmer storm. They come in. That would have been like the 1997 storm that we saw. Big melt off of the snowpack during New Year's of that time frame. But you can also have cold atmospheric rivers. So you can have a lot of moisture that's in the atmosphere, essentially a river in the sky.
Okay.
That's then goes up into the Gulf of Alaska, and you see this cooling effect that comes in there. And so you can also have atmospheric rivers bring in really big snowfall events. So a lot of 2023 was driven by multiple atmospheric rivers that were colder storms.
Okay. All right. Thanks for that. You mentioned earlier that some of those larger forecasts that you were anticipating didn't fully materialize. What are some of the factors that kind of determine whether or not those come to fruition?
So yes, we do see that not always those forecasts, I wish they were 100% accurate and, that would make my job so much easier. But what we see is that ideally forecast skill improves as you get, closer in lead time, right? That 16-day forecast, you're not going to bet, if you were gambling, you wouldn't bet as much on a 16-day forecast as you would on a 5-day forecast. Now, something that was unique about those December storms was how far apart forecasting was during that time. And the main reason for that is because it was driven by an atmospheric river event, and it can be very difficult to be able to forecast the landfall of an atmospheric river. So although as it's coming in through the, across the Pacific towards the coast of California, it seems like it's, on a direct path for the Tuolumne Watershed, that once it hits the coast and its interaction with even the coastal mountain range, you can all of a sudden see it shift northwards, or you can see it split. And that's kind of what we actually saw with those storms in December. The first one ended up going northward as soon as it hit the coast. And the second one actually split around the Tuolumne Watershed. It did almost feel like we had like a big, block across us that was keeping it from hitting our watershed. Even just watching the radar, it would be coming through the local area, and all of a sudden I would see it dissipate and go around to the Merced and the Stanislaus, and the Tuolumne seemed to not receive as much. It was getting just kind of the edges of those storm trajectories.
That's not necessarily a protective bubble we want.
No, not all the time. And that's something that, those bubbles that you can see, that's something that we see building up in the system and happening a little bit more commonly. So not necessarily where there's a single bubble over the Tuolumne Watershed, but what we do see is a transition to big ridges sitting over the coast of California. And so what those do is after that December storm, we ended up going into a long period of not seeing any rainfall locally or within the watershed. And the reason for that was a high pressure ridge built up. And those are pretty resilient. So back in the 86 to 92 drought, it was first termed as a ridiculously resilient ridge because they do hold on really tightly and they don't like to move out. And really what we've seen in order to get those to break apart is sometimes it does take a pretty big amount of moisture from the Pacific pushing against that ridge. And oftentimes when those ridges break, you can see big rainfall events immediately after. And that's kind of what helps explain why we see that stair-step pattern in our rainfall events of big deluge followed by a long period of really dry conditions rather than what we talked about of that, oh, it's just gradually moving up. We're having a lot of small little frontal storms. Instead, it is big atmospheric river, high pressure ridge follows, and then you're, following this pattern of boom and bust in the system.
So based on where we are now then, what is the outlook for the rest of this water year?
So as I mentioned, right now we are currently encroached in the flood control space. And so we are in constant conversations with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers about ensuring that we don't have risks moving forward when it comes to flood control liability. And so that's why we're tracking forecasts, looking at, are we seeing any big storms coming up? Do we need to evacuate the space immediately to create space for that storm? Or is it looking dry? Can we maintain our current releases, which right now we're targeting about 3,000 CFS within the river, and slowly bring the reservoir down over time and kind of stair-step it into the period in which we can actually start storing more water, which is around that April 27th date. And so a lot of this is that we've seen these large spring storms in the past, so that's where we are really tracking those storms closely. And then one bad thing about spring is forecast skill does typically go down. So winter, usually you have better forecast skill. This winter might have been a little bit questionable about the forecast skill. But as you go into spring, they are more variable as they come in because you do have less of those atmospheric rivers. You can get some of those systems that kind of just pop up into the watershed.
That's interesting.
And the other thing is when you enter into spring, typically you are going to see a little bit warmer of storms. You don't have as many of those really cold events coming in that March and April period. So this is where we have to pay a lot of attention to that and why the Army Corps is also so invested in how we're operating and what our plans look like to, ensure that we're maintaining the right amount of flood control space within the system. But at the same time, we also want to have water reliability and water availability. So we're looking at, is there opportunities similar to last year where we can hold on to some of these earlier runoff events and be able to hold on to that water as we go into the summer season and when our peak demands start to come into the system.
Right. So anything currently in the 8-day or 16-day forecasts?
So unfortunately, 8-day is looking dry and warm, which most people are probably already feeling. And from a personal standpoint, I love a weekend where you can sit outside, especially somehow in the middle of March that happens. Right. But on a professional level, I don't love to see that because it does mean that we are going to start to see that snowpack ripening and getting ready to run off. And when we're already at a low snowpack and we're going to see some of it, some of those losses when we're already encroached, we can't capture it right now. That part you don't love to see those dry and warm weather. Now, on the 16-day, it's been a little bit variable. So we've seen a couple of forecasts come out where it looks like, hey, there might be some rainfall and it might be at a 6,000 foot level. So not going to be completely melting our snowpack as it comes in. And then, the next forecast cycle, 6 hours later, it's all gone. So that's where we're kind of in that place. And I think that's very indicative of what you see in that springtime period of those 16-day forecasts really having big swings within them for, cycle to cycle.
Okay. So we will just sit tight and be patient and see what the spring brings us.
Exactly. It always keeps you on your toes.
Very good. All right. So with all of this current information then, the board of directors just set the 2026 irrigation season. And what did they decide for this year?
So for this year, they went ahead with a 48-inch available water based on staff recommendation. And a lot of that is due to the fact that we are in a very similar position to last year. And actually, we're almost 207,000 acre feet higher in the reservoir than we were last year at this time of setting the irrigation season. Our current snowpack is in a very similar position to last year. I think the one difference is last year we were seeing a lot of activity in the 8 to 16 day forecast versus right now we aren't seeing a lot of activity. But that's, not necessarily a bad thing right now because we are already encroached, and whether or not we could capture that, it would have been, questionable. But because we are in overall, mass balance in a similar position to last year, we are expecting very similar operations. Now, it always can change. Like I said, it can turn really wet and it can turn really dry, but the available water will be maintained at 48 inches. And then the season will be starting March 12th. So coming up very soon.
Yeah.
And then going to the end of it at October 28th.
Okay. Very good. Well, that is good news for our growers. Well, Olivia, while we always love having you join us to give us a hydrology update, because it seems like, there's never a similar year from one year to the next. So it's always interesting. But we really wanted to have you on today to dig into a big project that you worked on, the Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment. What is that?
Yes. So where we were talking about earlier, hydrology updates, a lot of that is dealing with, the current year and then planning for a year or two forward, any of that drought planning that we're doing. With the climate change vulnerability assessment, we're looking at what is our system reliability going long term. And I think the best place to start is first talking through what is climate versus what is weather, because I think that is often something that gets confused when people are talking about this. And so climate is related to the overall global atmosphere. That's your climate that you're in. And then the weather is what you see day to day.
Okay.
The best kind of analogy I like to think of is that climate is like your personality, weather is like your mood that day.
Oh, okay.
And so it gives you some relation of your personality can be very bubbly, but you can also be, also be upset.
You have a bad day every once in a while.
You have a bad day.
Okay.
And so that's where you can see where the climate is warming, but then you can have extreme cold events even within that warmer climate.
Okay, that makes sense. All right. So now that we have a better understanding of weather, which is a little more localized and immediate, versus climate, how does the climate change vulnerability assessment kind of help us assess what's going on?
So the importance for us of doing the climate change vulnerability assessment was that oftentimes you use the past to plan for the future. But what happens when your past is no longer applicable? Mm-hmm. So you're constantly breaking records. Mm-hmm. And when you're saying you're trying to plan for the next year and it doesn't represent anything you've seen before, well, then there's something wrong with your history. Something has changed. And in that case, it is the changing of the climate. We are seeing greater volatility within the system. So the averages are staying the same, but we're seeing wet years like 2017, 2023, and then drier and longer droughts. So looking at 2012 through 2015, 2020 to 2022. So these big droughts that you're seeing that our system was not originally built for, right? The new Don Pedro was built in the 70s, and that was based on hydrology from the decades before that.
Right.
And now we're sitting this many years later, and we are seeing very different conditions, and we're trying to use the same system to respond to that.
Okay. So what are or were the goals of conducting the recent assessment?
Some of the goals of it was to be able to first capture what is our current volatility. So what is that distribution? Because we don't want to be in that place of not expecting these extreme wets and extreme dries, and knowing that those are sitting within our planning criteria and the data sets that we're using to plan upon. So one is looking at what is our current volatility, because we've already experienced some climate change. And so what is our current climate today? And then what could be those future variabilities in the hydrology, because really infrastructure is built for extremes. It is not built for averages. And so how do we capture that? And that's something that we wanted to do with this assessment. Is TID had previously done other assessments. So back in 2012, we conducted a climate change study. But a lot of that was looking at more of those averages and, not a true quantification of what happens to the system. So although we looked at what happens with hydrology, okay, we might see a loss of snowpack, a little bit more of intense rainfall events. But one, we need to quantify how often those are happening and what that distribution looks like. And then, is our system built for that? That's the other question of what do we need to do to adapt? So that's where this study wanted to translate, not just looking at what happens to the hydrology and how's that changed, but how do our current facilities respond to those changes? And are they already able to mitigate that? Or do we need to start looking at other options and looking at how do we change our current operations of our facilities, improve those, or, potentially looking at, do we need more infrastructure in order to be able to capture these wetter wets and make it through these drier dries?
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. So what does the process to develop an assessment like this actually look like?
So the old way of doing it, just to kind of give a reference, is a lot of it was based on what's called the delta method. And once again, that was based on averages. It says, okay, you're going to see a 3% decrease in precipitation and on average a 2 degrees Celsius warming.
Okay.
And you would take your history and you would apply those changes to your historical record and you would run that through. The problem with doing that is what we know is that difference between weather and climate, and that doesn't let us know if there are going to be some of those days that it does get colder, or is our maximum temperatures actually moving different than our minimum temperature? So maybe on average temperature is increasing, but is it increasing more in the minimums or in the maximums?
Okay, sure.
And then could we see changes in timing of events? When you do that other method, you're just assuming that your historical events and the timing of those events maintains. But as we move forward, we might actually see changes in how those events move along, and whether or not you see the same kind of frequency of those types of events.
Sure. So how do you, or maybe are there specific tools that you use to kind of help you move from this perspective of averages to be able to capture the full distribution of what's changing or what's happening?
Yes. So back in 2012, when we did our original assessment, there wasn't the tools available to be looking at how do you capture the full distribution of what the future could look like. But what we ended up doing is we did a kind of public-private partnership. And so we worked with Cornell University as well as with the Department of Water Resources to develop a tool called the Weather Generator. And no, it's not creating rainfall or any of those things. Instead, the purpose of it is to take the historic Tuolumne weather conditions and then plug in all of the information that we know from climate change research related to what we might see in changes within the system. And ideally, rather than trying to find a single future to plan upon, instead, let's look at all of the probable futures ahead of time. And because you are running so many different scenarios, so through the weather generator, we created almost 1,000 years of data. And so it's 1,000 years of unique weather events that instead of having to wait to live through them, instead we're able to have that climate scenario. So whether it's 1 degree of warming, 2 degrees of warming, under those conditions, what could we expect, and be able to ideally see some of those really wet events or those really long drought periods, and what does that system create over the long term?
Okay. So would I be correct in assuming then that kind of helps you sort of look at the extremes on either end, and then you can use that to kind of surmise, are we ready to handle those extremes? Or what do we need to do to be ready to tolerate those extremes?
Exactly. So that was the process of after we used the weather generator to create all of these plausible futures under different levels of climate change, we then had to see how does that work with the system. So we have this weather. Now we need to first then translate it into hydrology. So that's what happens to the snowpack? What happens to runoff? What about soil moisture? All of these standing questions about the Tuolumne River watershed. So we were actually able to use our internal hydrologic model, HFAM, in order to do that. So HFAM is what we use for our current daily operations. And for this, we were actually able to use it for this long-term planning to be able to capture what those changes were with all of these weather conditions. And then from there, once you get that hydrologic output, you can then put it into a tool that we have called SOAR. So which is the Systematic Operations and Analysis for Reservoirs tool that is then can take hydrology. It looks at your reservoir, looks at your demands, and can then identify what kind of flood control operations would need to happen under that hydrology? What kind of water supply are you able to support under that hydrology? And from there, we can look at where is our system potentially vulnerable moving forward? Basically, at what level of climate change does our system break? Maybe we can make it through a degree of warming. And it's only at 2 degrees of warming that we start to see changes. And so that was one of those standing questions of what is that future look like? And maybe different, global climate models, they all have different projections of what climate change looks like and how rapidly it progresses.
Sure.
But ours is looking at what is the actual risk to that. The risk is a combination of the probability and the consequence. And so we needed both of those things in order to be able to start our long-term planning for adaptation.
Okay. So now the assessment looked at climate change, but if I understand correctly, there are 2 types of climate change defined within the assessment. Can you break those 2 down for us?
Yeah, so in the assessment, we looked at both thermodynamic and dynamic climate change. So to break that down, thermodynamic is just related to the overall kind of warming of the climate. It's the relationship between when you increase temperature, what happens to the system. So the best way to explain it, I like to think of as a sponge. If you warm the climate, then you get a bigger sponge from the atmosphere. Well, a bigger sponge can absorb more water. So that's where you can get these drier dry periods, right? It's thirstier atmosphere, so you can see increases in evapotranspiration. So plants have a lot more losses due to evaporation. And you're going to go through longer periods of things being dry. But then also with a bigger sponge, when it finally does wring out, there's a lot more water behind it.
Okay.
And so that's where that's dealing with the kind of more the magnitude of storms.
Okay.
So what we see is that those smaller events that we used to have, they don't happen as often, or they have less precipitation related to them. And those big events that we had get bigger.
Got it.
And so that's where you do see this change in, big events getting bigger, small events getting smaller.
Yeah.
That spread. Then with dynamic climate change, that's related less about the magnitude of the storms, but more related to the frequency. So dynamic climate change has to do with things, they're called weather regimes.
Okay.
But examples of weather regime is similar to what we talked about earlier, that ridiculously resilient ridge.
Okay.
That is a common weather regime or larger atmospheric pattern that impacts weather to the Tuolumne Watershed. So when we see that atmospheric pattern, we know we are going to experience dry conditions. We're not going to be seeing any kind of wet weather.
Okay.
Versus there can be a pattern in which there's a low pressure over our area, meaning that we have tons of opportunity for wet events to come through. And so dynamic climate change looks at what is the frequency of those different weather regimes. And what we are seeing is it does seem that those resilient ridges are getting more resilient. So what we call it is they're getting stickier.
Okay.
So they're holding on longer, and that they're happening more frequently. So when you're looking at dynamic, you're looking at a potential loss to the frequency of events coming in. And so when we're looking at the combination of those two is we're seeing a change in magnitude and frequency of storm events.
Okay, got it. So now you've gone through the assessment, and what does that say, or what are the impacts to our system?
So what we're looking at with this warmer climate and the fact that we are going to see these, potentially bigger events and that they are coming in warmer is a transition from what we call the Tuolumne currently is a snow dominant watershed to a rain dominant watershed. And the reason that's a problem for us is our snowpack acts as another reservoir for us.
Right.
So it holds onto the water during a time period where we don't really need it, right? We don't have irrigation demand at that time. And so it can sit up there. And then as we need it, going into spring when irrigation starts, that's when it starts to run off and fill our actual storage reservoir of Don Pedro and be able to serve that demand. So that's the importance of the snowpack for us. And as I mentioned earlier, with snowmelt, it's a lot easier to do long-term forecasting, right? Snowmelt is in the matter of, you're talking about weeks to months when you're thinking about planning for snowmelt runoff. Instead, when you go into a rain-dominant watershed, so if you're getting these big atmospheric rivers coming in and they're warm, so that all of that runoff is coming in immediately, instead of some of it going to snowpack, some of it going to soil moisture, it's all coming into your reservoir during a time when you can't use it, right? And that you do need to maintain a certain amount of storage to prepare for the next storm event. So you wouldn't be comfortable holding on to all of that water when you're in early December and you get a big storm that fills up your flood control space. Some might say, well, why don't you just hold on to that water? Well, we can't do that because you never know when that next storm is going to come in and you need that space available again to be able to capture it. Otherwise, you're stuck with that chasing your inflows, and you could see extremely high flows going into city of Modesto, and we aren't able to maintain our channel capacity.
Right.
So that's the overall risk that you see is this flood risk, because rainfall events are hours to days when you're making those decisions.
Yeah.
And really, as a water manager, time is your best friend.
Sure.
That is how you make things look smooth and you average things out, is by having enough time to plan on the volume and be able to release it in a more proactive fashion rather than this reactive environment that a rain dominant watershed would have within it. And, rain dominant watersheds are within California currently, but usually the channel capacities you see within those systems is over 100,000 CFS.
Okay.
So when that rainfall comes in, you can immediately release it all. For us, because we have that small channel capacity, you don't have the responsiveness to be able to release that water quickly.
Because again, the infrastructure has been built to what the typical has been. So in a more rain-dominant watershed, you see those larger capacities because they know that's how their water is coming in. Whereas we've built to hold on to that snowpack and sort of have a more regular or more systematic release of that snowpack into our system.
Exactly.
Okay. So now, with understanding all of the impacts, what are some of the overall takeaways that you've learned from completing the assessment?
So from completing the assessment, unfortunately, one of the takeaways was that with the climate change we've already seen is our system is already vulnerable. And that wasn't, overly surprising. We saw that in 2017, having to open up our system, or in 2023, the fact that we started making flood control releases when we were 600,000 acre feet below our flood control space, that it indicated 340,000 acre feet is not enough.
Not going to cut it. Yeah.
For that kind of event. And so we had to utilize greater flood control space to respond to that event. Or an example of being last year when we needed less than 340,000 acre feet, and we didn't need to wait till April 27th to start filling the system, that because you had that earlier runoff, that we needed to adjust our operations and those rules that were created based on that old hydrology in order to also have the benefits on the water supply side and capturing water when you can and when it's available, while still having that measured risk when it comes to the flood control liability.
Okay, so how then will those takeaways inform TID's next steps and future planning?
So part of it lets us know what we've already been doing has been good and that we need to continue on the path of making investments in the forecasting tools that we have, making improvements on our current methodologies, making sure that we're maintaining our current infrastructure as well. But then it also is that we need to do more. That you can only flex your system so much, and that soon Mother Nature is going to have her way, and that you need to be able to be prepared for those things. And so if we are seeing this shift of our system from a snow dominant to rain dominant, and as we mentioned, channel capacity is really important for being able to be responsive to that. So maybe we need to look at adding infrastructure into our system to have other places to convey that water to. Okay. And can we add conveyance capacity into that? So this is where we start looking at how do we layer in this climate change vulnerability assessment with our water supply augmentation study. So this is something we presented to the board last year as well, where we are looking at what added conveyance do we need in our system. Do we need to add more storage to our system? And is any of this going to help us mitigate these changes for climate change? Mm-hmm. And so by layering these, we ensure that we're making the right decision and we're not overbuilding the system, but also that we're not underbuilding the system because these are big investments for us.
Sure.
Similar to what we did with Don Pedro, that was a big investment, but we've seen the benefits of that in the fact that in a 70% water year, you can provide a full available water.
Absolutely.
That's one of those great benefits. Or that even in the fourth year of drought, like 2015, although we had reduced available water, you were still able to provide some surface water.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that's where you see those benefits of making those big investments, but that we don't want to underbuild and make that investment and think that we're okay. And 10 years from now, we're back in the same position.
Yeah, right.
And these, building these types of projects can take decades.
Yeah.
And so we don't want to be behind when we're doing this. So those are some of the those are the bigger mitigation things and kind of the more obvious things. But then there are the kind of lower level fruit that we need to pick off for kind of the immediate response, right? Like those are coming in decades from now. How do we respond to the changes we already have? And this is where we've started conversations with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to relook at our flood control operations because those, what we call it's a rule curve. It was based on, a more average hydrology. It was based on a snow dominant watershed that you had plenty of runoff after April 27th to fill up that 340,000 acre feet of space. So there was no need to be able to capture water earlier. And so you could evacuate that space. And also 340,000 acre feet was plenty to get through a typical rainfall event in December. But as we mentioned in those examples, it's not.
It's not the case anymore.
Yes.
Yep.
And so we need to have a more dynamic flood control curve to respond to this more dynamic climate and hydrology that we have. So that's where we're starting to have those conversations of where is forecast skill and how can we use some of these forecasting and technologies that we've brought in and these models that we have to then have that added into our flood control manual.
Okay. So now you've talked about the Army Corps of Engineers several times now. TID is actually launching a pilot project with the Army Corps. What is that pilot looking to determine?
So this pilot project is kind of that first bite at the apple. Like we were saying, these are the low-hanging fruit. This is the first bite at it. And one of the, kind of easier things to look at is our fall drawdown. So as I mentioned, we have to bring down our reservoir by October 7th to have that full 340,000 acre feet of space. Mm-hmm. But as we're looking at it, the thought is, do you need 340,000 acre feet of space in October when you still have plenty of irrigation demand that we're still serving through that month? Mm-hmm. We also have environmental releases that we make in that month. And we also don't see big rainfall events happening in that month. So why is it we have the same amount of flood control space for October 7th as we do on December 31st?
Right.
When you're looking at the types, the frequency and the size of the storms that you see in those timeframes. So we've been working with Scripps Institute. So that's through UC San Diego, who does a lot of that atmospheric river research. They do a lot of improvements to forecasting.
Okay.
to look at historically what is the risk during those timeframes for atmospheric river events, and do we need to have that full 340,000 acre feet of space? And from that, we found really you don't see that risk in October, and that risk of any kind of bigger events doesn't start till about mid-November.
Okay.
And so part of what we want to pilot is, can we push out our curve to actually not have that 340,000 acre feet of empty space until mid-November timeframe? So with this, it's going to be a pilot. So it's about a 5-year pilot deviation. So we're going through that process, making sure that, we are maintaining the same amount of flood control coverage within the system, because we don't want to take on any greater risk in the system. But this is our first kind of, let's test this out and show that there can be benefits in certain years where we don't have to respond to every fall storm, and that we can use some of that water to serve irrigation and to serve our environmental releases during that time frame.
Okay.
Yeah. And then the kind of bigger bite at the apple with the Army Corps that we would be working on is a spring deviation. So the operations that we've been talking about of 2025, where we were encroached in the flood control space, saved 100,000 acre feet for the space. In spring, for those earlier runoff events, we want to make that to where it's not so much as this ad hoc thing and we don't know whether we can get those approvals year to year. Instead, where we could have a little bit more guarantees behind it. And so with this, we would be one of the first kind of snow rainfall dominated watersheds that would be looking at something like this, and also a watershed with such small channel capacity.
Okay.
So when you're thinking about from the Army Corps of Engineers perspective, if they're allowing a deviation in kind of in the springtime period for a reservoir that can pretty much empty its entire flood control space in a day.
Yeah.
That's very different than for us to empty our flood control space. It can take almost a month in order to do that. And so those are very different operations and very different amount of liability for them. And so we're looking at how do we balance both the water supply needs and the flood control needs of the system, and making sure that we're responsive and that we're using science in order to drive those operations. So that one is going to be a little bit longer of a process. There's still a lot of research that needs to be done, a lot of discussions that have to be done in order to see how do we operationalize it. It sounds like it's a great idea on paper.
Sure.
Yeah, why wouldn't you just make a decision based on what you know at that time? But there is a component of, okay, we do need to have backstops.
Yeah.
And there always should be some amount of backstops to these operations, and that technology does fail. And so what are going to be some of those safeguards, and looking at how we build the best kind of system to move forward and be responsive to a changing climate and a changing hydrology.
Yeah, absolutely. Very interesting opportunities to explore, that's for sure. Very good. Okay, so we're kind of getting to the end of our time together. Is there anything else that you'd like to add on for our listeners?
No, I think we went through a lot. I know climate change is always kind of a lot to digest. And it is one of those things, like we talk about, of what keeps you up at night. This is one of those things.
That's it.
For a long time, of what kind of water year are we going to have? And is our system going to hold up? Those are big questions, and what are we going to do moving forward? So it's both the scary part, but also it's very exciting to start talking about, now what are we going to do about it? Rather than, I think there was a long time where it was very focused on the gloom and doom of climate change. Now it's, where are our opportunities in order to harden our system? Maybe it is that we aren't so reliant on surface water, and we try and move a lot of those wet year water into groundwater to help us sustain. And how do we flex our system and use all of the resources available and ensure that it's also able to serve all of the demands within the system? So that way overall California water is more resilient and also is more responsive to the needs of all Californians.
Very cool. Excellent. Well, Olivia, thank you so much for being with us yet again, and we look forward to having you back.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to the TID Water and Power Podcast. You can find TID on Facebook at facebook.com/TurlockID, on Instagram at Turlock ID, and on LinkedIn as the Turlock Irrigation District. I'm your host, Constance Anderson. We'll see you again next time.